Welcome back to part 4 of my Resident Evil Retrospective. Today we're going to be talking about Resident Evil Code Veronica. With the massive success of Resident Evil 2 in 1998, the series had now proven itself as a viable universe with potential for long-term development, opening the doors to an ever-expanding catalogue of titles. Capcom soon began work on more Resident Evil projects, both direct sequels and spin-offs across multiple consoles. One of these projects was an attempt by producer Shinji Mikami to port Resident Evil 2 over to the Sega Saturn. The development team had managed this successfully with the first Resident Evil game, albeit with a few quality concessions and a bit of technical black magic, but Sega's hardware just couldn't cope with the graphical demands of Resi 2, and the project was ultimately scrapped. Capcom, to their credit, weren't willing to abandon their Sega fans just yet, so Mikami was directed to begin an entirely new Resident Evil project that would work around the Saturn's technical limitations. This new game didn't get beyond the planning stage before Sega announced a change of direction, moving resources away from the struggling Saturn and shifting their focus to the upcoming Dreamcast console. The Dreamcast would suffer from none of the Saturn's hardware flaws, allowing for far more sophisticated graphics and sound and much larger games. Mikami knew an opportunity when he saw one and immediately requested that this new Resident Evil game should be targeted at the Dreamcast. Capcom's executive agreed with his plan, but only if he could provide a third Resident Evil game on the PlayStation to avoid alienating their Sony fans. A smaller team was thus formed to work on this game, which would eventually become Resident Evil Nemesis, leaving Mikami and the bulk of his developers free to pursue the Dreamcast title, which would become Code Veronica. So now that nobody's confused, let's move on. The Dreamcast's superior hardware would allow the game to be rendered in full 3D, doing away with the need for static pre-rendered backgrounds. However, the developers were wary of straying too far from this tried and tested gameplay approach. The plan instead was to compromise and have partially movable cameras that could track and pan, following the player character as they navigated the environment. The use of fully 3D game worlds also allowed for effects like dynamic lighting, shadows, proper collision detection, and even bullet impacts. The story of Claire Redfield looking for her missing brother Chris was a major plot thread that had been left open since Resident Evil 2, so the writing team were keen to pursue this with Code Veronica. They'd also grown bored of the American Midwestern setting of the previous games, so they decided to set Code Veronica on an island in the Southern Ocean, with the finale taking place at a research base in Antarctica. This change of location allowed the design team creative freedom to pursue different themes and ideas, eventually settling on a vaguely European Gothic horror look. The Gothic horror feel is emphasised through the antagonist Alfred Ashford, an insane aristocrat obsessed with the fate of his failing bloodline. It sounds good, but as it turns out, splitting your dev team between two competing, resource-heavy projects on different systems doesn't make for a happy company, and Capcom soon found themselves struggling to keep up with the demands of these two games. Nemesis had started out with a small staff of about 20 people, but development proceeded faster than Code Veronica, which needed an entirely new game engine on an untested platform, and as a result, more staff were moved over to complete Nemesis in time for Christmas 1999. With Capcom's resources increasingly focused on Nemesis, Mikami was forced to outsource a lot of Code Veronica's development to keep things rolling. Mikami himself still oversaw the game's scenario and direction, while XAX Entertainment assisted with environmental rendering and Nextech handled the technical development. Sega, who were desperate for a hit game to promote their new console, were totally on board with Code Veronica, and by September 99 they were actually sending some of their own developers to Capcom to help them out. The release of Nemesis in late 99 allowed Capcom to focus all of its resources on finishing Code Veronica, and in early 2000 the game finally launched onto Dreamcast. Critics praised the game's graphics, pace and storyline, and it was soon embraced as one of the best games to be released on that system. Unfortunately, sales weren't as positive. The Dreamcast had been released well ahead of the other 6th generation machines, but it didn't really matter. The tide had already turned in Sony's favour, and the Dreamcast had an uphill battle to win back customers to Sega. Sales of Code Veronica lagged on Sega's ailing console, and Capcom knew the Resident Evil series couldn't hope to survive on Dreamcast alone. Tough choices had to be made. In 2001, an expanded version with longer cutscenes, sharper graphics and more features named Code Veronica X was released on the PlayStation 2, and for what it was worth, it also made it to the Dreamcast, which by this point was already in its death throes. The game was eventually ported to the Xbox 360, the PlayStation 3 and even the GameCube, becoming highly successful on all of them and eventually going on to sell 2.5 million units worldwide. Right, so that's the history lesson out of the way. How did Code Veronica actually play? Well, since I've never owned the Dreamcast, I'm going to focus on the PS2 version for review purposes. Code Veronica kicks off 3 months after the events of Resident Evil 2 with an action-packed intro depicting Claire Redfield trying to infiltrate Umbrella headquarters in Europe in search of her brother Chris. Needless to say, things don't go well and she's soon captured and packed off to some remote prison island in the South Atlantic. But before anyone can say pick up the soap, the island comes under attack, the lights go out and Claire is released from her cell. From then on, it's your job to venture out into the darkness, discover what the hell is happening and find a way to get off the island. Along the way you have to fight off zombies and other nasties, forage for weapons, ammunition and key items to progress to new sections, and unravel the mystery of the enigmatic Ashford family who control the whole show. So far, so Resident Evil, but things have changed. As previously mentioned, Code Veronica is the first Resident Evil game to feature fully 3D environments. The camera is still largely based in static locations, but it will now pan around the room to follow your movements and occasionally track you if you're wandering along a fixed linear path like a corridor. This new system allows for increased interaction as well as environmental effects like dynamic lighting, rain and fog that add to the atmosphere. It looks pretty good for a game that has its origins on the Dreamcast, and the camera generally performs well, eliminating some of the frustration of the fixed system used in previous games. But there are downsides to this new format. First, the character models. They all have this weirdly stiff, unnatural quality to them when they're moving around. When you run, they don't bounce up and down like regular people do. It's like you're gliding across the floor rather than putting one foot in front of the other. You also move about the same speed as an obese man on the home stretch of the London Marathon, and while the increased polygon count allows for actual facial animations this time instead of the head bobbing of previous games, their faces all look strangely blank and glossy. The environments are pretty much as well realised as an early 6th generation would allow. Textures are reasonably detailed and the dynamic lighting improves the feeling of immersion, but there is a kind of bland, soulless look to the whole thing that I often find with Dreamcast ports. They were almost there in terms of 3D rendering, but they just couldn't reach the right level of detail to really bring it home, and the fog effects look suspiciously like they've been added to limit the draw distance. Also, the same textures crop up more often than I'd like, meaning some areas can start to look a little generic and samey. The 2D backgrounds of previous games might not have been ideal, but there was a certain charm to knowing that they'd been drawn by real artists instead of just assembled out of stock components like in Code Veronica. The plot is intriguing enough to keep you motivated, and it's actually quite fun trying to figure out what everyone's up to. You spend the first half of the game playing as Claire, who's tougher and more resourceful this time around, but still comes across as likeable and compassionate. The same can't be said of Steve, her supporting character. I don't know if it's the voice actor or the terrible dialogue he's been given, but Steve just comes across as a whiny, annoying brat that I was happy to part company with as soon as possible.
Huh? You're not a zombie? Well, great. Wait right there. I'm coming over.
However, it's not long before Claire's big brother Chris muscles his way in. Although it's kind of jarring to switch characters mid-game, I liked it for being unexpected, and I had to admit it was nice to take control of Resident Evil's main hero once again. Sadly, there's no sign of Barry, master of unlocking Burton this time around, but Chris isn't the only character from the original game to make a return. After a 2-game absence, everyone's favourite sunglasses-loving villain Albert Wesker is back, which is kind of surprising when you consider what happened at the finale of the first game.
What? Don't come this way! No!
His return is kind of explained in the course of the story, but basically you can chalk it up to plot convenience. Now infected with a controlled version of the T-virus, he's much more menacing and dangerous than before, and his conflict with Chris is well developed and compelling. The voice cast gives it their all, and it's clear they're taking things more seriously than before, even if the script doesn't always live up to the occasion. I can't say the same about the game's other bad guy, Alfred Ashford. Unlike the antagonists of previous games, he has no particular agenda that he's pursuing and no plan to work towards. He's just a madman obsessed with his dead twin sister, and as for his voice actor, well...
You don't fool me! I am Alfred Ashford, commander of this base!
One slight drawback to the story is that it tries to provide an overly elaborate origin story for the T-virus. In the original game, it was just a weaponized virus created by Umbrella that got out of control. Fair enough, but now we've got to deal with a whole load of needless exposition about the Ashford family and their obsession with bees and incest. On the gameplay front, weapons and enemies are standard Resi fare. There's your usual zombies, dogs and hunters, plus a few obligatory bosses, including a new tyrant. Likewise, your weapons include the normal selection of pistols, shotguns, assault rifles and grenade launchers. Fights are challenging enough to hold your interest, and the game really makes use of its new 3D capabilities, but they should rarely trouble experienced players. I have to say though that the puzzles are actually quite good in this installment. Some of them are tough enough to make you think hard, but never so obscure that you'll get frustrated. Summing Code Veronica up is a bit of a difficult one then, because it's a game that's always left me with mixed feelings. On the one hand, I recognise it as a bold attempt to take the series in a new direction, but on the other, I feel that it may have attempted more than the hardware of the time would allow. Still, it's a solid and engaging experience, and I'd be lying if I said I hadn't enjoyed it. It's been ported to pretty much every console known to man, so it's not difficult to get hold of in 2018. Fans of the series should definitely play it, if for no other reason than to experience the next step in the Resident Evil saga. And that's the end of part 4 of my Resident Evil Retrospective series. I hope you're enjoying my work so far. If so, please consider hitting the like and subscribe buttons, and I'll see you in the next episode where we step backwards in time and review the Resident Evil remake.